Nathan met his gaze calmly. Maybe it should. Maybe division is better than pretending we all forgot what happened. Greg's jaw tightened. You're tarnishing your own family name by dragging up old grudges. My grandfather did what he had to do. Everyone did. You don't understand what that time was like. I understand enough, Nathan said, and I'm not tarnishing my family's name. I'm restoring it. You can choose to keep defending the lie. That's on you. Greg's eyes flickered with anger, but he said nothing more. He turned and walked back toward the road where his father waited, his shoulders stiff. Nathan watched them go, the silence between them stretching like a gulf that would never close. That night, the valley was still. Nathan sat on the porch with a lantern beside him, its light flickering against the wood. Across the fields, he could see faint headlights winding down the distant road as the last visitors left. He should have felt relief, maybe even triumph, but what he felt instead was a quiet ache, a mixture of pride, grief, and exhaustion. The truth was free now, but it had cost him something. Part of his peace, perhaps. Part of the illusion that time could heal what history refused to forget. When he finally went to bed, he dreamed of the chamber. In the dream, it was filled with light, and people moved within it, women and children, their faces soft and smiling. His grandfather stood among them, his hands resting on the shoulders of the smallest boy. When Nathan approached, the old man looked up and nodded once, as if to say, "Thank you." Then the vision faded, leaving only the faint sound of footsteps climbing toward the surface. The next morning, he woke to find the oak framed in brilliant sunlight. The county workers had arrived early, setting up markers and photographing the site for preservation. Miss Mabel came again, carrying a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were 2 old photographs, their edges worn. One showed Elijah Carter standing by the oak, a young man beside him, Nathan's father, no more than 10 years old. The other showed a group of strangers, 3 women and 2 men, all dark-skinned, all dressed in plain clothes, standing in front of a wagon. On the back was written, in faint pencil, "Safe, 1942. Mabel smiled when she saw Nathan's expression. "I found them in my attic. I think they belong here, with the rest." He took the photographs carefully, his throat tightening. "Thank you," he said. "I didn't think anything like this still existed." "Truth always leaves traces," she said softly. "Sometimes it just waits for the right hands to find them." By afternoon, a small wooden sign stood at the edge of the field. It read, "The Carter Refuge, established 1942, site of historical preservation." The workers packed up their tools and left, leaving Nathan alone once more. He walked down to the oak and placed the photographs inside the chamber, laying them atop the trunk like an offering. The air inside felt different now, no longer heavy but calm, like a room that had finally exhaled after holding its breath for too long. As he stepped back into the sunlight, he saw a piece of paper fluttering near the fence. He picked it up and realized it was a page from an old local newspaper, the same one that had printed the story about the barn fire all those years ago. It must have blown from one of the reporter's folders. He stared at the brittle paper, then folded it carefully and slipped it into his pocket. Some stories, he thought, needed to remain close to the heart, not just displayed behind glass. That evening, when the sun dipped behind the hills and the sky turned the color of old bronze, Nathan stood again at the edge of the field. The oak's branches rustled gently above him, and the door beneath it gleamed faintly in the fading light. The field was silent, except for the whisper of crickets and the distant call of a mourning dove. He thought of the people who had once crouched in that chamber, terrified, hopeful, clutching one another as they waited for the night to carry them forward. He thought of his grandfather's courage, of his father's silence, of Miss Mabel's memory, and of the generations that had carried the story without ever speaking it aloud. All of it had led here, to this quiet moment beneath a tree that had watched it all. Nathan knelt and touched the ground, his fingers pressing into the damp soil. "It's done," he whispered. "You can rest now." The wind moved through the grass, soft and slow, like a sigh of relief. And for the first time in his life, Nathan felt that the land itself was at peace. The same land that had once hidden its shame, now holding its truth openly beneath the sun. The morning after the unveiling carried a strange stillness, a sense that the valley itself was holding its breath. Nathan greeted them quietly, his voice steady though his chest ached. Dr. Hines took his hand, squeezing it with a kind of reassurance that didn't need words. "Are you ready?" he asked. "No," Nathan said, managing a faint smile, "but it's time." They walked together toward the hill, their footsteps sinking into the damp ground. The oak tree loomed larger with every step, its roots twisting through the earth like veins. Nathan stopped a few feet from the door and took a deep breath before kneeling to pull away the brush he had used to hide the entrance. The wooden planks looked darker now, the carved initials J.C. glinting faintly in the sunlight. He turned to the group, his hands trembling slightly. "This," he said softly, "is what the storm uncovered." The journalist leaned closer as he unlatched the door. It groaned open, releasing a breath of cool air from below. Dr. Hines went first, descending the narrow slope into the chamber. Nathan followed, holding a lantern high. The beam caught the rough stone walls, the old hooks, the scattered remnants of life long gone. The silence in the room was heavy, yet not oppressive. It felt like reverence. The others entered slowly, their whispers fading as they absorbed the space. Dr. Hines crouched by the trunk and opened it carefully. The letters lay inside exactly as Nathan had left them, their edges curled but intact. The historian lifted one with both hands, as if afraid it might crumble. "This," he said quietly, "is the kind of evidence historians dream about but rarely find. Every word here is a voice returned from silence." The journalist with the camera stepped forward, the shutter clicking softly as she documented the scene. The carved walls, the soot-stained stones, the small child's shoe Nathan had found in the corner weeks before. Her expression softened. "You can almost feel them here," she whispered. Nathan nodded. "They were afraid," he said, "but my grandfather made sure they had a place to rest, even if it was just for a night." They spent hours in the chamber, documenting every detail. Dr. Hines read portions of the letters aloud, his voice steady but emotional. One note in particular seemed to strike everyone deeply. "The road north is long, but the man with the kind eyes said we would make it. He said the night was our friend." Hines lowered the paper, his voice catching. "Your grandfather was that man," he said, "the one with the kind eyes." Nathan turned away, blinking hard. He had never known Elijah Carter, but now it felt as though the man's spirit filled the room, watching quietly from the shadows. For a long time, none of them spoke. When they finally emerged, the light outside had shifted, the afternoon sun casting a soft gold over the field. A small crowd had gathered near the oak, neighbors, curious locals, and even a few students who had come with Dr. Hines. Word had spread quickly that something remarkable was happening on the old Carter land. Nathan hadn't expected so many faces, and for a moment he felt the weight of their gazes pressing on him. Dr. Hines stepped forward to address them. "What we've found here," he began, "is not just a hidden room. It's a fragment of history, a piece of courage that was almost erased." Elijah Joseph Carter, a farmer of this valley, used his land to shelter people fleeing racial persecution in the 1940s. At great personal risk, he provided food, shelter, and a path toward freedom. His work was part of a quiet, undocumented network of men and women who believed that humanity was not bound by law but by conscience. The crowd listened in silence, some shifting uncomfortably, others leaning forward. Among them, Nathan spotted Thomas Harper and his son Greg standing near the edge of the group. Their faces were tight, unreadable. Dr. Hines continued, "This discovery tells us something powerful, not only about one man's bravery, but about how easily truth can be buried when fear takes root. For 80 years, this land kept its secret. Now, thanks to Nathan Carter, that secret will no longer be forgotten." Applause rose softly, uncertain at first, then stronger. Nathan stood still, the sound washing over him. He wasn't used to being the center of attention. He felt like an intruder in his own story. But as he looked around, he saw faces shining with something close to pride. Miss Mabel was there, leaning on her cane, tears glimmering in her eyes. She nodded to him, a silent acknowledgement that the burden her generation had carried in whispers was finally lifted. After the crowd dispersed, a few people lingered. The county officials discussed plans to preserve the site, and Dr. Hines promised to draft a proposal for its designation as a local heritage landmark. But not everyone was pleased. As Nathan turned toward the house, Greg Harper stepped into his path. "You're making a mistake," Greg said in a low voice. "You think digging all this up is going to bring peace? It's only going to divide people again." Nathan watched as the historian photographed each document. "So, it's true," he said. "He wasn't just helping strangers. He was part of something larger." Hines nodded. Larger and more secret than anyone wanted to admit. After Reconstruction, the country liked to believe the worst was behind it, but for many it wasn't. People like your grandfather kept that old promise alive, the one that said no man should be left to the mob or the whip. But for every man like him, there were those who thought peace meant silence. They emerged into the sunlight, blinking. Hines wiped the sweat from his forehead. "Mr. Carter, I'd like to include this in my research. I think your grandfather deserves recognition. We can archive the letters properly, preserve them. If you're willing, I'll contact a few journalists who specialize in historical restoration. This story deserves to be told." Nathan hesitated. "Told, yes, but not owned. This is my family's history. I don't want it turned into some academic trophy." Hines smiled faintly. "Then you tell it. I'll help make sure people listen." They spent the rest of the day cataloging the site. As evening fell, Nathan walked the historian back to his car. The sky was purple with the first hint of dusk. "You'll have resistance," Hines warned before leaving. "Some folks in small towns prefer their heroes dead and their sins forgotten. But truth has a stubborn way of surviving. I've learned that much." Nathan watched him drive away, dust rising behind the car like a trail of ghosts. He turned back toward the farmhouse. In the fading light, the oak tree looked less like a guardian and more like a witness, silent, patient, unyielding. He thought of his father again, of how the man had carried the weight of this secret until it hardened into silence. Nathan understood now why his father never spoke of the past. Silence had been his shield, the only way to keep the family safe. But Nathan had inherited a different world, and in this world, silence felt like complicity. He decided to write it down. That night, he sat at his desk with a clean notebook and began to put the story together piece by piece. The fire, the letters, the betrayal, the discovery. The words came slowly at first, then faster, as if his grandfather's voice was guiding his hand. When he finished, it was nearly dawn. The first light touched the horizon, and for the first time in weeks, Nathan felt a strange peace settle over him. He stepped outside, barefoot in the dew. The valley was quiet, the world freshly washed. He looked toward the hill where the oak stood, its roots entwined with the bones of history. The chamber beneath was no longer just a relic. It was a testament. The truth that his grandfather had risked everything to protect had finally begun to breathe again. Nathan knew the fight wasn't over. Men like the Harpers would try to deny it, to twist the story, to claim that nothing good could come from a man like Elijah Carter. But he also knew something deeper. The truth was no longer theirs to bury. It belonged to the land, to the letters, to every quiet act of courage that had ever bloomed in the shadows. And as the sun rose over the wet fields, Nathan made a silent vow to give his grandfather's name back its dignity, to restore what fear and fire had stolen. The truth had waited long enough. Now, at last, it would stand in the open. The sun rose pale and uncertain that morning, as if unsure it wanted to be part of what the day would bring. The air over the valley carried the smell of wet soil and cut grass, sharp and raw after the recent storms. Nathan stood by the kitchen window, staring at the distant oak, its dark silhouette resting over the land like a memory. For days he had been preparing, gathering the letters, the charred fragments of his grandfather's notes, and the photographs Dr. Hines had taken. He hadn't slept much. The idea of strangers walking on his land unsettled him, yet he knew it was necessary. The truth could not live alone in the dark anymore. By mid-morning, the road to the farm began to stir with movement. A small convoy of cars appeared on the horizon, winding through the fields like a slow procession. Nathan's heart quickened as he stepped out onto the porch. The first car, a dark sedan, stopped at the gate, and Dr. Hines emerged, wearing the same battered hat and a look of nervous excitement. Behind him came two journalists from a local paper, a woman with a camera slung around her neck, and a man with a recorder hanging from his wrist. Another car brought a pair of older residents from town, people who had known the Carters in their youth, and finally a vehicle marked with the seal of the County Historical Society. It was all real now. The secret his father had spent a lifetime guarding was about to be spoken aloud. The hum of the reader filled the room as he scrolled through reels of film, the black and white headlines sliding past like ghosts. For a long time he found nothing, only notices about ration stamps, train departures, and the occasional obituary. Then, as he turned to a reel marked August 1942, his breath caught. The article was small, just a few paragraphs buried in the middle of the page. The headline read, "Local investigation closed, no charges filed." The body of the text described an inquiry into reports of unlawful sheltering of displaced persons on private property south of Brook Hollow. It stated that no evidence of ongoing activity had been found, though suspected parties were cautioned against further interference with federal matters. There was no mention of names, but in the margin, barely visible in the scan, was a handwritten note. Carter Farm. Monitor situation. Nathan stared at the words until his eyes burned. Federal matters. That was what they called saving people. He printed a copy of the article, careful not to let his hands shake. As he gathered the rest of his materials, Julia approached again, curiosity lighting her eyes. "You find something interesting?" she asked. "Something that shouldn't have been forgotten," he replied quietly. Back outside, the day had brightened. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth, and for the first time in days the clouds began to break. As he drove home, sunlight spilled across the hills in long golden streaks. But his thoughts were dark. The article confirmed what he already suspected, that the law had known what his grandfather was doing and had chosen to let others deal with it quietly. No trial, no evidence, just a warning and a fire to erase the rest. When he reached the farmhouse, Miss Mabel's old sedan was parked out front. She sat on the porch, wrapped in a shawl despite the warmth of the afternoon. "You've been busy," she said as he approached. "I had to see the records for myself," Nathan said, sitting beside her. They knew Mabel. The sheriff, the county, they all knew. They called it federal interference. They looked the other way while someone else handled it. She nodded slowly. That was how things worked back then. If they couldn't punish a man legally, they'd let fear do it for them. Your granddaddy knew that too. That's why he stopped." "He didn't stop," Nathan said, pulling the folded paper from his pocket. "He was stopped. The article said no evidence of ongoing activity. That means there was evidence once. Someone made sure it disappeared." Mabel looked out toward the oak, her eyes clouded with memory. "Maybe so, but it didn't all disappear. You found it, didn't you? That means something. The truth has a way of clawing its way back up, no matter how deep folks try to bury it." Her words lingered as he watched her drive away later that evening. He stood for a long time on the porch, listening to the cicadas rise from the wet fields. He could feel the pull of the chamber beneath the oak, as if the land itself was urging him to bring its secret back into the light. He would not keep it hidden any longer. The next morning, he called the university in the nearby city and asked for the Department of History. When the secretary transferred him, a man's voice answered, brisk and curious. Nathan introduced himself and explained what he had found. There was a pause. Then the man said, "You've got my attention, Mr. Carter. Letters from the 1940s mentioning safe passage. That's significant. Can you bring them in?" Nathan hesitated. "I'd rather you come here. There's more than letters. There's a place. An underground room. You'll want to see it yourself." The historian arrived 2 days later. His name was Dr. Samuel Hines, a middle-aged man with kind eyes and a weathered notebook he carried like a talisman. He listened carefully as Nathan told the story, then followed him across the field to the oak. The sun was high and the air shimmered with heat. When Nathan opened the door and the cool breath of the chamber rose up, Hines drew in a quiet breath. "This is remarkable," he said, stepping inside. His flashlight swept over the stone walls, the soot stains, the old hooks. "It's intact. This could very well have been a hiding place. The craftsmanship suggests it wasn't built in haste. Your grandfather must have planned this carefully." Nathan showed him the trunk and the letters. Hines handled them gently, reverently, as though holding something sacred. "These aren't just thank you notes," he murmured. "They're records of a network. See the wording here. Next stop, safe road, children arrived. This matches the patterns of post-slavery refugee routes. There were still informal lines of escape during the 1940s, especially for families fleeing racial violence in the Deep South. What your grandfather did, this was dangerous, even decades after emancipation. "And so your family made sure he did?" Nathan asked quietly. For a moment, Greg said nothing. Then he spat on the ground. "You don't know what it was like back then. People were scared. A black man hiding runaways on his land. It brought the law, the clan, everyone. Maybe you think you'd have done better. Maybe you'd have risked your family for strangers." He stepped forward, lowering his voice. "But we did what we had to do. My grandfather told him. He said it was for the safety of the town, and if Elijah Carter got caught in the middle, that was his choice." Nathan's hands clenched. He was saving lives. Greg's eyes flickered, a brief spark of shame before hardening again. And he lost his own, let it stay buried. He turned and walked away, his boots crunching over the gravel. Nathan stood frozen, the words echoing in his ears. He lost his own. The wind picked up, bending the grass. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rumbled. Nathan looked toward the oak tree, its silhouette dark against the horizon. He could almost see the flames his grandfather must have seen that night, the barn burning, the secret dying with it. But now, after all these years, the truth had come back into the light, refusing to stay silent. He walked to the porch and sat down, staring at the storm clouds gathering above the hills. His father's words from that old note whispered through his mind. He did it for them, not for himself. That line had always felt like a riddle. Now it was clear. Elijah Carter had built a sanctuary for the hunted, and in doing so, he had made himself the hunted too. The Harpers had betrayed him not just out of fear, but because his courage had shamed them. As the first drops of rain began to fall, Nathan made a silent promise. He would not let the truth die a second time. The world might have forgotten, but he hadn't. He would gather every letter, every document, every scrap of proof, and show the world who Elijah Carter truly was, a man who risked everything so others could live. The thunder cracked above him, sharp and echoing. He looked toward the fields where the oak stood proud against the storm, and thought of the word carved into its roots: trust. His grandfather had trusted the wrong man once, but Nathan would not make that mistake again. This time, the truth would not burn. The rain had lingered through the night, washing the dust from the windows and leaving the world outside gray and glistening. When Nathan woke, the air in the farmhouse felt charged, as if the storm had not passed but merely paused above the valley, waiting. He moved slowly, the weight of yesterday pressing on his shoulders. Greg Harper's words still echoed in his mind. We did what we had to do. There had been no remorse in his voice, only the weary justification of men who had convinced themselves that betrayal was virtue. Nathan couldn't shake the image of his grandfather standing in the burning barn, watching years of secret work go up in flames because someone had decided he'd crossed a line invisible to them but holy to him. He made coffee and sat by the window as the morning light seeped through the clouds. The oak tree stood like a monument on the hill, dark against the wet grass. It seemed smaller now, more mortal, yet somehow more defiant. Beneath its roots slept the truth that generations had chosen to forget. Nathan thought about what to do next. He had the letters, the journal scraps, and the story Miss Mabel had told him, but those were fragments, whispers. If he wanted the truth to stand against the decades of silence, he would need proof. Official, recorded, something that even the descendants of men like Thomas Harper couldn't dismiss. He decided to drive back to the county seat, to the archives Miss Mabel had once mentioned existed beneath the courthouse. It was an hour's drive through winding roads lined with old sycamores and fields still littered with puddles from the rain. The courthouse sat in the center of town, an aging brick building with ivy crawling up its sides. Inside, the smell of paper and dust mingled with the faint hum of fluorescent lights. At the records office, he met a young archivist named Julia, who greeted him with polite curiosity. She was thin, with wire-rimmed glasses and a soft voice that seemed out of place among the heavy silence of the old halls. When Nathan explained what he was looking for, local incidents during the war years, reports involving the Carters or the Harpers, her brows lifted. "That's going back quite a ways," she said, glancing at the logbook. "Most of our records from that period are incomplete. The old sheriff's ledgers burned in 45, but some civil reports survived. You can look through the microfilm if you like." He followed her to a back room where a single flickering bulb lit the narrow space. "Pray for them. Pray for mercy." Below the words was a shaky signature, EJC Elijah Joseph Carter. Nathan sank onto an old crate, the papers trembling in his hand. He felt as though the barn itself was watching him, the walls closing in with the weight of memory. His grandfather had carried a secret of compassion, but also one of guilt. Maybe the fire hadn't been meant to destroy evidence. It had been meant to erase the shame of betrayal, to protect others who were still part of the same chain. He spent the next hour exploring every inch of the barn. Behind one of the wall panels, near where the soot was thickest, he found a hollow space. Inside it was a tin container, the kind used for tobacco, filled with scraps of paper and a small cloth pouch. The papers were too damaged to read fully, but one fragment contained a list of names, written in careful, steady handwriting. Some names had check marks beside them. Others had been crossed out. It looked like a ledger, a record of those who had passed through, those who had reached safety, and those who hadn't. At the bottom, barely legible, was a final note. After L and the boy, no more. Too dangerous. Too many eyes. H watching. Nathan closed the tin and sat in the dust, the faint smell of smoke still lingering after all these years. He could almost see the scene play out. His grandfather, standing in the same spot, holding this ledger, hearing the crack of flames as the barn caught fire. Maybe Elijah had tried to save the records, but failed. Maybe he'd buried what little he could before the fire consumed the rest. The sunlight shifted, and Nathan looked up to see the shadow of the oak stretching through the open barn door. He thought of the underground chamber beneath its roots, of the carved word "trust" he had found burned into the wall. It wasn't a message to others, it was a reminder to himself, a warning. By evening, Nathan's resolve had hardened. He couldn't keep what he'd learned to himself. If his grandfather had been part of something greater, a network of resistance, of compassion, it deserved to be known. And if the Harpers had betrayed that, their guilt deserved to be remembered too. The next day, he drove into town, stopping by the small county library. The building was nearly empty, and its shelves lined with dust-covered records. The librarian, a gray-haired man named Ellis, who'd gone to school with Nathan's father, greeted him with polite surprise. Nathan explained he was researching family history, looking for local news from the 1940s. Anything about fires, missing persons, or incidents during the war years. Ellis nodded, intrigued. "You might want to check the 1942 papers. There was a lot of trouble around then. Folks moving through, some arrests. People didn't talk much, but you can find more in the old archives." Nathan spent hours hunched over the brittle pages, the smell of ink and time filling his nose. Most of what he found was mundane: crop reports, church socials, war bond drives. But in the August edition of 1942, he found a small article tucked near the bottom of the page. Fire destroys local barn. No injuries reported. The text was brief, almost deliberately vague. It mentioned a blaze on the Carter property south of Brook Hollow, blamed on lightning, and ended with a single line. Authorities investigating possible link to runaway activity in the area deny involvement. Nathan's heart pounded. There was more. The next column, a separate piece, spoke of rumors of illegal transportation of persons across county lines, and quoted Sheriff Whitman as saying, "Those who harbor fugitives from justice will face full prosecution." Fugitives from justice. That was how they had been described. The people his grandfather had helped, families fleeing violence, injustice, or forced labor, had been labeled criminals, and those who helped them, like Elijah, had been branded traitors to the law. Nathan left the library as the sun was setting. The air smelled of rain again, heavy and electric. He drove home with the windows down, the papers on the seat beside him fluttering in the wind. Every mile he drove seemed to take him deeper into the past. When he reached the farmhouse, he saw a figure waiting near the gate. It was Thomas Harper's son, Greg, leaning against the fence with his arms crossed. His expression was hard to read in the dim light, but his posture carried a warning. Nathan parked the truck and got out. "You've been asking questions," Greg said without preamble. "My dad told me." "I have," Nathan said calmly, "and I found some answers." Greg's jaw tightened. "You're stirring up old lies. That's dangerous talk." "Lies?" Nathan took a step closer. "Your family's name is in my grandfather's records. He wrote, 'Don't trust H again.' What do you think that means?" Greg's face darkened. "It means he didn't know what he was talking about. It means he brought trouble here and nearly got people killed. My grandfather warned him to stop. He didn't listen. That night, sleep would not come. He sat by the window, the letters spread before him once again, each word burning brighter in his mind. The truth was close, he could feel it. So close it almost breathed with him. His grandfather's life, his father's silence, the Harper's evasions, they were threads of the same fabric, knotted and hidden but not gone. He rose, crossed the room, and opened the small drawer in his father's desk. Inside were old receipts, a pocket knife, a photograph of his mother long gone. Beneath them lay something else, a folded page yellowed by time. He unfolded it carefully. It was a note in his father's handwriting. "If you ever find it, remember, he did it for them, not for himself. Don't let anyone tell you different." Nathan stared at the words until his vision blurred. He looked out the window toward the dark line of the oak tree. The field lay silent under the moon, but he felt the pull of it again, that ancient call of unfinished things. The door was still there, waiting. And now he knew that behind it lay not only his grandfather's secret, but the truth about his family's courage and its betrayal. The shadows of the past had risen, and he could no longer pretend not to see them. The morning that followed was strangely quiet, as if the land itself were waiting for something. The fog that usually clung to the low fields had lifted early, leaving the valley bare and pale beneath the light of dawn. Nathan stood by the window with a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. His eyes wandered over the fields, but his mind was elsewhere, back in the conversation with Thomas Harper. Every word of that exchange replayed in his head like an unfinished argument. The thin smile, the warning tone, the refusal to answer directly. It had all said more than the man intended. There was guilt behind it, or fear, or maybe both. He set the cup down and ran a hand over his face. The letters still lay on the kitchen table, spread out like pieces of a broken map. He stared at the one marked with the faint pencil note, HRP, and felt the same chill he'd felt in that dark chamber under the oak. It could not be a coincidence. The letters might have been initials or a coded warning. Either way, they pointed in one direction: the Harpers. By midday, Nathan decided he couldn't let it rest. He took the box of letters, the lantern, and a notebook, then walked out toward the old barn. The structure leaned slightly, as though the years had bowed it under their weight. The boards were gray and split, the roof patched with rusted tin. This barn had stood since his grandfather's time. His father had always refused to tear it down, claiming it was part of the land's memory. Now, as Nathan pushed the doors open, that memory rose around him in a cloud of dust and old hay. He walked slowly through the space, the floor creaking beneath his boots. Light fell in narrow stripes through the gaps in the walls, illuminating floating motes of dust. He could almost imagine his grandfather here, hands thick with calluses, carrying buckets, humming under his breath as he worked. In one corner, near the foundation stones, he saw the blackened wood where the fire had once eaten its way up the wall. His father had told him lightning struck there, but now he knew better. The burn pattern was too deliberate, the edges too sharp. Someone had lit that fire from the inside. Nathan crouched and brushed away the debris. Something metallic glinted beneath the dirt, a corner of a small box, half buried. His pulse quickened. He dug it out carefully, the metal cold against his fingers. The lid was rusted shut, but after a few prees with his knife, it opened. Inside lay a handful of folded papers, charred at the edges, and a few tarnished coins. He unfolded one of the papers slowly, afraid it might crumble. The writing was faint but legible in his grandfather's hand. It wasn't a letter, it was a log. June 2nd. Woman with child, name unknown, from parish of St. John, stayed one night, departed with R. July 19th. 2 men, brothers, heading north, left before dawn, one limping, said he would send word. August 4th. Same woman returned alone, said the boy was taken, asked for help to cross river, sent with Harper contact. Do not trust H again. Nathan read that last line over and over, feeling the blood drain from his face. Do not trust H again. It was there, in his grandfather's own words, H for Harper. The betrayal wasn't rumor or suspicion, it was truth. The woman, the one Miss Mabel had called Liddy, had trusted someone she shouldn't have, and whatever happened after that meeting had cost her child his life. His grandfather had known who was responsible but hadn't dared speak it aloud. He found another scrap of paper, darker with soot. The ink had bled, but the words were still visible. Fired tonight, can't move them. Will hide records. Back at the farmhouse, Nathan spread the letters across the table once more. He looked for anything that might hint at names or places, but most were careful, vague. One letter, though, caught his attention. It had a smudge of soot on the corner, as if rescued from fire. In the corner, written in pencil instead of ink, were 3 letters: HRP. It wasn't a signature. It looked more like a note, a reminder. His stomach twisted. HRP, or maybe Harp, the Harpers. They lived just across the boundary fence on land that once belonged to Elijah's brother. For as long as Nathan could remember, the 2 families had coexisted uneasily. His father had dealt with them only when necessary, selling hay or borrowing tools in bad seasons, but he'd never shared a meal or a word more than required. Nathan had never known why. Now he thought he did. As the sun sank, he walked out toward the back field, where the old fence sagged under its own weight. Beyond it lay the Harper farm, larger, richer, white-owned. Their house stood on a small rise, painted bright against the darkening sky. He remembered working there once as a teenager, helping bale hay. Mr. Harper had been polite but distant, and his sons had looked at Nathan with the quiet disdain that didn't need words. He stood at the fence for a long time, watching the smoke curl from their chimney. The wind carried faint voices, laughter, maybe. It struck him how close the two families had lived for nearly a century, and how little they had ever known about each other, except for the stories passed down in whispers. When night fell, he went back to the oak. The moon hung low, silvering the field. The door beneath the roots looked different in the moonlight, less like a relic, more like a wound. He knelt, running his fingers over the carved initials again, tracing the grooves until splinters bit his skin. "What happened to you, Granddad?" he whispered. "What did they do to make you hide all this?" The wind moved through the branches, and for a moment he thought he heard a voice, distant, almost human. He knew it was only the rustle of leaves, but it filled him with unease. He opened the door just enough to let his lantern's light spill inside. The chamber looked exactly as he'd left it, but something about it felt changed, as though the air itself had shifted. He walked in, the crunch of his boots echoing softly. The blackened wall seemed to glimmer faintly under the light. He crouched and examined it more closely. There were faint shapes burned into the stone, patterns that might once have been letters, but were now only scars. He took a piece of chalk from his pocket, something he'd brought from the barn, and marked the places where the soot was darkest. They formed a line, then another, almost like words. He could barely make them out, but one stood clear. Trust. The rest was gone. He sat there for a long time, staring at the word until his lantern began to dim. Then he rose, extinguished the flame, and stepped back into the night. The valley was quiet again. A dog barked in the distance. Nathan closed the door and pressed it shut until he heard the latch click. The next morning, he made a decision. He would speak to the Harpers. Maybe they knew nothing, or maybe they knew everything. Either way, he needed answers. He cleaned himself up, put on a clean shirt, and walked the mile to their house. The elder Harper, Thomas, was on the porch sharpening a knife when Nathan arrived. He looked up, his expression polite but guarded. "Morning, Carter," he said. "Something wrong with the fence again?" Nathan shook his head. "I just wanted to ask you about my grandfather." Thomas paused, the knife still in his hand. "Elijah, what for?" "I've been learning about the war years," Nathan said carefully. "About people passing through here, about the fire." The older man's eyes narrowed slightly. "That was a long time ago." "Maybe," Nathan said, "but it still matters." Thomas wiped the blade on his jeans and stood. "Whatever stories you've heard, best let them be. Folks did what they had to back then. No sense digging it up now." "Did you know him?" "Enough to stay out of his business," Thomas replied, "and I'd advise you do the same." Nathan studied his face, looking for cracks in the calm. "He helped people, didn't he?" Thomas smiled thinly. "Depends on what you call help." Something in his tone made Nathan's stomach turn. "You knew," he said quietly. "You or your father, you knew what he was doing." Thomas's jaw tightened. "Careful, son." Nathan held his ground. "Someone betrayed him. Someone told the law, or worse. You wouldn't happen to know who, would you?" For a long moment, they stared at each other. Then Thomas sheathed the knife. "You're stirring up ghosts, Carter. They don't take kindly to that. Go home." Nathan left before the anger boiling inside him found its way into words. As he walked down the dusty path, he felt the man's gaze on his back until he reached the fence line. Miss Mabel was sitting on her porch when he pulled up, her rocking chair creaking in a slow rhythm that matched the heartbeat of the afternoon. She was small, her skin the color of walnut, her hair silver and tied back with a scarf. She squinted at him for a long moment before a faint smile curved her lips. "Nathan Carter," she said. "I was wondering when you'd come by. You've got your granddaddy's walk." The words hit him like a gust of wind, unexpected, intimate. He took off his hat, stepped onto the porch, and sat on the steps below her. For a moment, he didn't know how to begin. The smell of mint and old wood hung in the air. Finally, he said quietly, "Miss Mabel, did you know my grandfather well?" She looked out towards the trees, her eyes clouded with memory. "Knew him enough," she said after a pause. Elijah Carter was a man who kept his word, a stubborn one, too. Didn't care much what white folks thought of him. That's why some feared him and some respected him, but he never turned anyone away who needed help. Nathan's chest tightened. Did people come to him for help often? Mabel's chair stopped rocking. "You found something, didn't you?" she said softly. "You wouldn't be here otherwise." He hesitated, then nodded. "I found a room. Under the old oak by the south field, there were letters, dozens of them, dated 1942, all thanking him." For a long time she said nothing. Then she sighed, the sound heavy as falling leaves. "So the storm finally brought it out," she murmured. "I always wondered if that place still existed. Your daddy tried to cover it up after Elijah died. He said the land had seen enough trouble." Nathan leaned forward. "What kind of trouble?" She looked at him, and in her gaze was both pride and sorrow. "The kind that comes when a man does the right thing in the wrong time. There were people moving through here back then. Folks running from the camps, from debt farms, from places that still worked a man's back like he was property. The war was on, but down here, some things never changed. Elijah gave them shelter. Not just once, many times. He had a network, other families, colored and white both, who passed people along quiet roads at night, but word got around. Some didn't like that a black farmer had more courage than them, and one day someone talked. Nathan felt the air drain from his lungs. "Who?" She shook her head. "I don't know for sure, but folks whispered it was someone close, a neighbor, maybe even one of the men he sold corn to. That year the barn burned, remember? I was a girl, but I remember the sky red as dawn and the smell of smoke. They said lightning struck, but we all knew better." The words settled between them like ashes. Nathan thought of the scorch marks on the stone wall inside the chamber, of the soot that had blackened his fingertips. He thought of the final letter, the one written in his grandfather's hand. "Someone has spoken. Burn everything." He asked quietly, "Did my father know?" Mabel nodded. "Oh, he knew. He was just a boy when it happened, but he saw things he shouldn't have. After the fire, he swore to keep quiet. He thought silence would keep your family safe. Maybe it did, but it also buried Elijah's name with the truth." Nathan looked down at his hands. They were trembling slightly, the veins standing out against his dark skin. "Do you remember any of the families my grandfather helped? Anyone who survived?" She closed her eyes, sifting through her memories. "There was a woman once, came through with a boy about 5 or 6. Said her name was Liddy, though I doubt that was her real one. They stayed a night in the Carter's barn before moving north. Elijah brought them food himself, said they were headed toward the river where another man would take them across. But when the barn burned a week later, people said the woman and boy never reached the crossing." Nathan swallowed hard. "You think they died?" Mabel's eyes met his. "I think someone made sure they didn't make it that far." The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. The cicadas buzzed, a relentless hum that seemed to fill every corner of the day. Nathan rose slowly, his mind spinning. "Thank you, Miss Mabel," he said. "You've helped more than you know." She nodded, though her face looked weary. "Be careful, Nathan. Some ghosts don't rest easy when you start digging them up." He drove home in silence, the truck rattling along the gravel road. The afternoon sun burned through the windshield, but he felt cold. He thought about the woman named Liddy and her son, about how their story had vanished into smoke and silence. He imagined his grandfather's hands building that stone room, carrying bricks by lantern light, maybe praying under his breath as he worked. Elijah must have known that what he was doing could cost him everything, and yet he did it anyway. The thought filled Nathan with both pride and dread. Pride because his blood carried courage. Dread because secrets like this rarely stayed buried without reason. Someone had spoken, the last letter said. Someone had betrayed them. And in a small town, betrayal never stayed anonymous. He decided he needed to know more. There was one person who might remember, the old woman down by the crossroads, Miss Mabel, who had known everyone and everything in this county for as long as anyone could recall. But he would go tomorrow. Tonight he needed to think. He placed the letters back into the box, careful not to damage the fragile paper, and hid it beneath the loose floorboard under his bed. That night the wind rose again, rattling the windows. Nathan lay awake, listening to the groaning of the old house. Every creak made him think of footsteps, of voices whispering in the dark. Once or twice he imagined he heard the faint echo of a child's laughter, but when he sat up, the room was empty. He finally drifted into a restless sleep filled with images of faces he had never seen, faces illuminated by the flicker of lantern light in a small stone room. When morning came, he went back to the door. The ground was drier now, the mud crusted over. He opened the door again, just to make sure it was real, that he hadn't dreamed it all. The air inside was cool and still. Nothing had changed. But this time, as he turned to leave, his lantern caught something carved into the stone near the entrance, a shallow groove shaped like an arrow pointing upward. It led toward the surface, toward the oak. He ran his fingers over it, wondering if it had been a marker, a sign for those who came seeking shelter. He stepped out into the sunlight, feeling the heat soak into his skin. The valley stretched out before him, quiet and indifferent, yet he sensed the weight of everything that had happened here, everything that had been forgotten. The door behind him creaked softly as he closed it again, sealing the darkness within. But this time he knew it would not stay sealed for long. He walked back up the slope, past the fields that shimmered with light, toward the farmhouse that waited like a sentinel on the hill. His father's ghost seemed to follow him, silent but watchful. Nathan could almost hear him say, "Some things don't need digging up." But it was too late. He had already begun to dig, and what he found had changed the ground beneath his feet forever. By the time he reached the porch, he had made up his mind. He would visit Miss Mabel, and he would ask her about Elijah Carter, about the year 1942, about anyone who might have vanished after that flood of whispers and fear. He would find out who had been sheltered on his land and why. And if there had been betrayal, if someone had spoken, he would know that too. He looked once more toward the distant oak, the hill still scarred from the storm, and felt the same pull he had felt since the flood. The sense that something buried was calling him home. He didn't yet understand what it meant, but he knew this was only the beginning. The past had found a crack in its grave, and he had been the one to open it. The morning light slanted through the kitchen window, striking the pile of letters on Nathan's table like a quiet accusation. He had spent the night turning over every word in his mind, unable to find rest. The names, A.M., Emsar, the child mentioned only as the boy, had begun to take shape in his imagination, their fear and gratitude echoing through his thoughts. The discovery had shifted something inside him, like a key turning in a long-locked door. His land, the soil beneath his boots, was no longer just the ground of his daily labor. It was layered with secrets, with memories of lives hidden and protected, perhaps betrayed. The air in the house felt charged, restless, as though it too carried the weight of unspoken history. By mid-morning, he knew he couldn't sit still any longer. There was one person in Brook Hollow who remembered the war years as if they had happened yesterday. Miss Mabel had lived her entire life 2 miles down the road in a small white house with peeling paint and a porch lined with clay pots that sprouted herbs and wildflowers every spring. Nathan remembered her from his childhood, her sharp eyes, her voice like creased paper. She had been older than everyone even then, but her mind was sharp and she had a way of knowing things people thought were buried. He loaded the letters carefully into a small tin box, wrapped it in cloth, and placed it in the passenger seat of his truck. The drive took him along a winding road bordered by pines and washed-out ditches still heavy with yesterday's rain. The world smelled of wet leaves and silt. As he passed the old church, its bell silent and rusted, he thought again of his father's silence, the way the man had avoided certain roads, certain people. Now it all seemed deliberate, like a map drawn by omission. Another simply read, "My brother did not make it, but my mother says your kindness will not be forgotten." The letters weren't military. They weren't about soldiers or battles. They were about people running. From what, Nathan didn't yet know, but the fear was clear in every line. He noticed that some of the envelopes bore strange markings, a symbol that looked like a small cross or a line drawn in haste, perhaps a code. Beneath the stack of letters lay a small tin box. He opened it and found several objects inside: buttons, a child's locket with a cracked photo, a few coins so old their images had faded. He picked up the locket and rubbed it with his thumb. The face of a young woman looked back at him, smiling faintly through the tarnish. He set it down carefully. The silence in the chamber was thick, the kind that makes you whisper without knowing why. The lantern's flame flickered, throwing long shadows that danced along the walls. He noticed hooks hammered into the stone, as if someone had once hung blankets or lanterns here. The floor bore faint grooves where crates or boxes might have rested. It wasn't a storage room, it was a refuge. He imagined people sitting here, waiting in the dark, listening for footsteps above. He thought of his grandfather, how he must have come down here bringing food or water, maybe whispering to frightened children that they were safe. The thought made Nathan's chest tighten. He had grown up thinking of his family as small farmers, men who kept their heads down and their hands busy. But this was something else entirely. He kept reading until his knees ached. The last letter was different. The handwriting was heavier, the words pressed deep into the paper. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It simply said, "They are closing in. Someone has spoken. If we are discovered, burn everything." There was no signature, only the initials J.C. Nathan sat back, the letter trembling in his hand. It felt as though the air in the room had thickened, pressing against his chest. Someone had betrayed them. His grandfather had known, and instead of fleeing, He had stayed long enough to write this warning. He glanced around the chamber again, noticing something he hadn't before. The wall behind the trunk was darker, discolored as if by smoke. When he touched it, his fingers came away black with soot. He ran the lantern closer and saw faint scorch marks climbing up the stone. A fire had burned here once, but it hadn't spread. Perhaps his grandfather had tried to destroy something and failed. Or perhaps he had succeeded in burning just enough to protect the rest. Nathan gathered the letters and tucked them into his jacket. He stood and looked around one last time. The small space, the smell of ash, the whisper of his boots against the stone, it all felt like stepping into a memory that wasn't his but belonged to his blood. He thought again of his father's silence, of the way he'd avoided questions about Elijah Carter. Now Nathan began to understand. This wasn't shame. It was protection. The old man had been hiding something worth guarding for generations. Outside, the world looked too bright. The sun had climbed higher, burning through the mist. Nathan blinked against it, feeling disoriented, as though he had stepped out of another time. He closed the door behind him, pressing it shut until the latch caught. The sound echoed like a sigh. He walked back to the house slowly, his thoughts racing. Who were these people in the letters? What were they running from? Why had his grandfather helped them, and why had his father buried the truth? He spread the letters on the kitchen table and read them again in the light. The paper was fragile, the ink fading to brown. Some bore stains that could have been from tears, or maybe rain. One had a small fingerprint in the corner, smudged but distinct. A child's, perhaps. As the afternoon wore on, he began sorting them by date, trying to trace a pattern. The earliest letters were filled with thanks and hope, talking about moving north, reaching safety. The later ones grew shorter, more anxious. The final few were almost desperate, mentioning trouble in town, raids, and the road being watched. He found one written in a woman's hand that said, "If we do not make it, tell my brother in Memphis that I kept my promise." There was no address, no name, only that plea. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the pile. There were too many coincidences for this to be random. His grandfather hadn't just hidden people once. He had been part of something organized. Maybe not the famous Underground Railroad. This was 1942, long after slavery, but something similar. A network of safety for those who still had to run. He knew from his father's stories that the South hadn't been kind even after the laws changed. Some men still thought they had the right to hunt and punish others. If Elijah Carter had offered shelter to the hunted, then he had done it in defiance of his time. The truck tires slid in the wet clay, spattering the fenders. He parked near the oak and stepped out. The ground still smelled of rain and rot. Birds were already awake, calling from the trees. He walked to the door, crouched beside it, and ran his hand over the surface again. This time, he noticed something he hadn't before. A faint marking carved into the wood, barely visible under the grime. It looked like letters, though he couldn't make them out yet. He brushed harder until the shape of the carving emerged. A simple J.C. He froze. Those were his grandfather's initials. He sat back on his heels, staring. The air seemed to thicken around him. This wasn't just an old door. It was something his grandfather had built, or at least sealed. And if his father had known, maybe that was why he'd forbidden Nathan from ever coming here. Maybe this door wasn't meant to be found. He stood, wiping the dirt from his hands, his pulse steady but heavy. The sun was rising now, spilling light across the valley. The wet leaves glowed like polished bronze. He looked one last time at the carving, at the dark crack between the boards where the chain had broken. He would come back tonight, when the air was still, when no one would see. The land around him was quiet again, but not peaceful. It felt as though something beneath his feet had shifted, something old that had been waiting, patient and buried for someone to find it. As he walked back to the truck, he didn't look over his shoulder, but he felt it. The weight of that door watching him go, the promise of secrets pressing up through the soil, whispering his family's name. Even before dawn, the air was heavy with the promise of heat, and the damp ground breathed out the smell of mud and roots. Nathan woke early, unable to shake the feeling that something had shifted inside him during the night. The image of the carved initials on the door, JC, wouldn't leave his mind. He brewed coffee, drank it, standing by the window, and stared at the faint outline of the oak tree silhouetted against the pale morning mist. He told himself that what he was about to do was simple curiosity, that it was just another piece of old farm history. But deep down, he knew this was different. He had grown up surrounded by silence about his family's past. Now that silence was cracking open, and he could not resist looking inside. By the time he reached the gully, the sun had barely risen, painting the sky with streaks of amber. Dew clung to his boots as he descended the slope. The door waited where he had left it, its chain broken, its surface glistening with moisture. The initials were clear now, cut deep into the wood, his grandfather's mark still defiant after all these years. Nathan set down the crowbar and lantern, drew a long breath and touched the handle. It was cold and rough beneath his palm. For a moment he hesitated, remembering his father's warning, but then he lifted the latch. The sound that followed was a low groan, wood rubbing against stone, as though the earth itself objected. A thin gust of stale air escaped through the crack, carrying the smell of old dust, iron, and something faintly sweet, like dried flowers. Nathan opened the door wider. Beyond it was darkness, a narrow corridor hewn out of stone, just high enough for a man to crouch through. He raised his lantern and stepped inside. The beam of light revealed a tunnel no longer than a dozen feet. The walls were rough, fitted with irregular stones, and the ceiling was low. The air was dry, almost unnaturally so, as if sealed from rain for decades. At the end of the passage lay a small chamber, no bigger than a tool shed. Inside it were a few objects scattered across the floor: a wooden stool, a cracked jug, a rusted lantern. But what drew his eye was the object in the center, a trunk bound with metal, its corners darkened by time. He knelt beside it. The latch gave way easily, the hinges creaking softly as he lifted the lid. Inside lay a stack of papers tied together with a piece of frayed cord. The top one was an envelope yellowed by age. He turned it over and read the faded ink. April 3rd, 1942. The handwriting was neat, careful, not military but domestic. He opened it with trembling fingers. The letter inside was short. To Mr. J.C., thank you for the shelter and for your kindness. We have reached the next stop safely. God bless you for what you are doing. The children send their love. Yours truly, A.M. Nathan read it twice. The words were simple, but there was something desperate beneath them, a quiet gratitude that carried the weight of fear. He took out another letter, and another. Each one was written by a different hand, each dated 1942 or 1943. They spoke of journeys, of hiding, of people who could not use their real names. One said, "We stayed in the cellar 2 nights. They were searching the roads. If not for your warning, we would have been taken. He rose and scanned the slope. The flood had stripped away much of the topsoil, exposing long-forgotten layers of the land. Bits of pottery, a horseshoe, a nail, fragments of other times. Maybe the door was just another relic, a leftover from when his grandfather built the barn or dug storm channels by hand. Maybe it led to an old root cellar, though it seemed too far from the house for that, but something about it, the way it sat hidden beneath roots and stone, the lock, the chain, made his chest tighten. He spent the rest of the morning repairing a section of the fence that had washed out, but his mind wasn't on the work. Each hammer strike echoed in his head, mingling with the image of that strange door. By noon, the sky had cleared, a pale sun glinting off puddles like shards of glass. Steam rose from the soaked ground. He walked back to the house, but every few minutes his gaze drifted toward the hill where the oak stood, guarding its secret. Inside, the house was quiet. The air smelled faintly of coffee and damp wood. On the mantel, an old photograph stood in a cracked frame, his father as a young man, standing stiff beside a mule. No picture of the grandfather. There never had been. Whenever Nathan asked, his father would deflect. He was a good man, but he made mistakes, was all he ever said. Once, when Nathan had been a boy, he'd found an old trunk in the attic and tried to open it, only for his father to snatch it away and lock it again. "That's not yours to look at," he'd said. "Some things don't need digging up." Now, decades later, those words felt heavier than they ever had. By afternoon, the water in the gully had receded enough that Nathan could climb down again without sinking knee-deep. He brought a crowbar, a hammer, and a flashlight. He told himself it was just curiosity. Just something to get his mind off the damage the storm had done. But in truth, he felt drawn there, as though the earth itself was urging him to see what it had been hiding all these years. Standing before the door again, he brushed away the remaining mud. The chain crumbled as he touched it, flakes of rust falling like old blood. The lock resisted, but only barely. He ran his hand along the frame, feeling the cold of the stones. Whoever had built this had done it by hand. The stones were uneven, fitted together without mortar, but strong enough to have lasted decades, maybe longer. He could see now that the door didn't lead down. It went straight into the hillside, level with the earth, as if opening into a tunnel. A faint smell drifted through the cracks, earth, dust, and something else, something old and dry. Nathan hesitated. He felt the same chill he'd felt the day he buried his father, standing by the open grave looking into the dark soil. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was reverence, a sense that he was trespassing somewhere sacred. He turned away. Not today, he told himself. He'd come back tomorrow with better tools, maybe even bring a friend, though he doubted anyone would care enough to help him dig around in the mud. As he climbed back up, he caught sight of the horizon. The sun was low, casting a golden haze across the fields. The fences threw long shadows, and the oak above the hidden door stood black against the light. He stopped halfway up the slope and looked back. The image of that door, half buried under roots, would not leave him. He had seen plenty of strange things in his life. Storms that twisted barns, droughts that cracked the ground open. But nothing had ever made him feel like this. That night, as the crickets began their slow, rhythmic song and the frogs called from the creek, Nathan sat on his porch with a cup of coffee, staring at the stars that flickered faintly through the drifting clouds. The air was thick, almost electric, the kind of night when the world seems to hold its breath. He thought about his father again, about the way he'd always avoided talking about the past. The Carters had lived on this land for nearly a century. If that door had been there all along, his father had to have known. He remembered one night when he was maybe 12. He'd wandered toward the gully with a lantern, chasing fireflies, and his father had caught him halfway down the slope. The man's face had been pale in the lamplight, his voice shaken with anger, or maybe fear. "You don't go down there, you hear me? That place is cursed ground." Nathan had never forgotten the way he said it. Not angry, afraid. Now, sitting in the quiet, Nathan whispered into the dark, "What were you so afraid of, Dad?" No answer came, only the hum of insects and the distant croak of frogs. The next morning, he rose before dawn. The fields still shimmered with dew, the sky a dull gray with streaks of pink. He packed his tools into the bed of his old pickup, shovel, crowbar, lantern, and a thermos of coffee, and drove the short distance down the muddy path that led to the southern slope. He was clearing the land after a heavy flood when he suddenly noticed something strange beneath the old roots. A wooden door, bound with rusty chains, Dot. When the farmer finally decided to open it, what he saw inside changed his life forever. Dot, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching this video from. The storm had passed, leaving the valley shrouded in a heavy silence that felt almost sacred. The wind that had howled all night had grown tired and slipped away beyond the ridges, and now only the slow dripping of water from the eaves broke the stillness. The ground was soft, swollen with the weight of last night's rain, and the air carried the faint metallic scent of earth and wet iron. Nathan Carter stepped out of his farmhouse and paused on the porch, squinting toward the fields that stretched beyond the bent fence line. What he saw made his heart sink. A mess of mud, broken branches, and a section of the southern pasture that looked as if the river itself had taken a bite out of it. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered and quiet, with skin darkened not just by birth but by years of sun, sweat, and labor. His hands were calloused, his jeans stiff from work and rain. He had inherited this land from his father, and his father from a man Nathan had barely heard stories about. His grandfather, Elijah Joseph Carter. People in town used to say the Carters were stubborn folk, too proud to sell even when times got bad, too attached to the ground that gave them little more than corn and broken backs. Nathan never thought of himself as proud. He thought of himself as surviving. The storm had been cruel. It had flooded the lower paddock, torn shingles off the barn roof, and left a brown trail of debris across the yard. But it was the southern slope that drew his attention, the place his father used to call the Old Cut, a deep gully that split the pasture in two, carved by decades of spring floods. His father had always warned him not to go down there. "That ground's no good," he used to say. "You'll twist an ankle, or worse. Let it be." Nathan never understood the warning. It was just mud and stone, a wound in the land that refused to heal. Today, though, something was different. The flood had eaten further into the bank, and from where Nathan stood, it looked like the earth had peeled open, revealing something flat and unnatural beneath the roots of an old oak tree. He grabbed his shovel and began the long walk toward it, boots sinking into the wet ground. Each step made a faint sucking sound, like the earth didn't want to let him go. The closer he got, the clearer the shape became. A patch of stonework, rough but deliberate, half buried in clay. At first, he thought it was part of an old foundation, maybe the remains of a storage shed long since collapsed. But when he cleared more mud away, the outline took form. Stones arranged in a curve, forming an arch. His breath caught. Inside that arch, pressed into the earth, was something wooden. He brushed away the mud with his hand, revealing the dark surface of what could only be a door. A door in the ground. The idea alone felt wrong. It wasn't part of any cellar or storm shelter he knew. The wood was ancient, dark as pitch, the grain swollen from years of damp. A rusted chain crossed it, secured by a lock so eaten by time it barely held together. Around it, the roots of the oak had grown like living bars, weaving through the stone as if nature itself had tried to keep the door sealed. Nathan crouched, touching the cold metal. The lock felt brittle beneath his fingers. He stood there for a long while, staring at it, the drizzle pattering against his hat. He felt something stir inside him, a quiet unease, like stepping too close to the edge of a memory. His father's voice came back, the warning tone sharper now. "Don't go down there, boy. That place has no business being opened again." But again? What did that mean? Nathan had always assumed it was superstition or an old man's paranoia. Now, looking at that door, he wasn't so sure. If you want to hear what happened next in stories like this, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next upload. Click the bell to get notified when the next mystery drops. And if this story kept you watching till the end, share it with your friends so they can uncover it too. And now tell us, where are you watching from? Your comment might appear in the next video. Her words lingered long after she left. As twilight settled, the field glowed in the orange light, and the oak's shadow stretched across the hill like a dark river. Nathan walked to the barn, the same old structure that had survived both fire and time. Inside, he could still smell the faint trace of smoke beneath the scent of hay and dust. He stood in the same corner where he had found his grandfather's notes, tracing the outline of the blackened boards. They were cool to the touch, but beneath the surface, he thought he could feel warmth, a pulse of memory, perhaps, or simply the echo of all that had happened here. He opened the small box that still held the burnt fragments of Elijah's writing and read them again under the fading light. The last entry was barely legible, but one line stood clear. "Truth will rest in the roots. Someday they will find it." Nathan smiled faintly. His grandfather had known even then that what he was doing could not be erased completely. The land had remembered, even when men tried to forget. That night, a light breeze moved through the valley, bringing with it the faint smell of rain and something older, earth, stone, and memory. Nathan lit a single candle and carried it down to the oak. He placed it before the door and watched the flame flicker against the wood. In the soft glow, the carved initials seemed almost alive. "You can rest now," he whispered. "We all can." The candle burned slowly, its light reflected in his eyes. He thought of all the names and the letters, the ones who had made it north and the ones who hadn't. He thought of Liddy and her boy, of Miss Mabel's youth, of the Harper's betrayal, and of the silence that had followed for generations. It was all part of the same story, a story of fear, loss, courage, and finally, redemption. When he returned to the porch, the candle's light was still visible from the hill, a small star in the darkness. He sat down, listening to the quiet night, and felt the strange calm of a man who has completed a circle he didn't know he'd been walking. For the first time in his life, the valley didn't feel haunted anymore. It felt whole. In the weeks that followed, the story spread beyond Brook Hollow. Journalists came and went. Photographers framed the oak in the golden light of morning, and history teachers brought their students to see the door in the earth. Some locals still muttered about stirring up old wounds, But even they stopped arguing when they saw how many visitors left with tears in their eyes. The carter's name, once whispered with suspicion, became a symbol of quiet defiance. Nathan refused to turn the site into a spectacle. He built a simple fence around the oak, enough to protect it from damage, but not to keep people away. He wanted them to walk close enough to feel the soil, to understand that history wasn't just words carved into plaques. It was the ground beneath their feet, alive with the echoes of those who had walked before them. One evening, as autumn began to creep across the hills, Nathan received a letter from a woman in Louisiana. It was written in elegant cursive on aged paper. She claimed to be the granddaughter of a woman named Lydia Turner, the same name mentioned in one of the burnt ledger entries. Her grandmother had spoken, before her death, of a farmer with kind hands who gave her hope when she thought God had forgotten her. The letter ended with a simple line: "I think your grandfather saved my family. Thank you for finding him again." Nathan read it twice, then folded it carefully and placed it inside the old trunk in the chamber. He left the trunk open this time, its contents bathed in the warm light of his lantern. The air in the chamber felt lighter, freer, as though the past had finally drawn its last deep breath and exhaled. When he returned to the surface, the sky was filled with stars. The field stretched out in quiet silver under the moon, and the oak stood tall, its branches trembling softly in the night wind. He paused at the door one last time, tracing the letters J.C. with the tips of his fingers. The wood was smooth now, polished by years and memory. He turned toward the house, his silhouette cutting through the moonlight, and walked slowly up the hill. Behind him, the door caught the faint shimmer of starlight, glowing like a promise kept. The valley, once burdened by silence, now breathed with life. The roots that had once hidden the truth now guarded it in peace. And somewhere, deep in the earth, beneath the weight of years, Elijah Carter's courage lived on. Quiet, steadfast, eternal. Don't leave just yet. There's more waiting for you. The air was light, almost sweet with the scent of damp grass, and a thin mist clung to the fields. Nathan awoke before sunrise, stirred not by noise, but by the absence of it. For the first time in months, the restless weight inside him seemed to have lifted, though what filled the space it left behind was harder to name. Something between peace and sorrow. The events of the day before played in his mind like a film without sound. The faces of strangers standing in reverence near the oak, the sound of cameras clicking, the words Dr. Hines had spoken about courage and conscience. And then the silence that had followed, deep and long, as though the past itself had leaned forward to listen. He stepped outside barefoot, the grass cool under his feet, and looked toward the hill. The sign stood there now, small but solid against the morning light. The Carter Refuge, 1942. It looked both out of place and perfectly natural, as though it had always waited there to be named. He walked toward it slowly, his breath visible in the early chill. The oak's branches swayed gently, the faintest whisper moving through the leaves. He placed a hand on the wooden post that held the sign, the smooth new surface contrasting with the rough texture of the old tree beside it. Beneath his hand, the wood was still damp from the dew, but warm where it caught the sun. Nathan's mind wandered to his father. He imagined him standing here years ago, before the storms, before the silence had calcified into something unbreakable. His father had been a man bound by caution, shaped by a world that punished those who remembered too loudly. Nathan could see him clearly, broad-shouldered, weary-eyed, always carrying the invisible burden of something unsaid. "Some things don't need digging up," his father had once told him, but Nathan understood now that the old man's warning had not come from ignorance. It had come from love, the desperate kind that tries to protect by hiding. The silence had been his father's way of guarding the flame until someone else could bear to uncover it. As the sun climbed higher, voices began to rise from the road. A few cars slowed near the gate. People from town had started visiting the site, drawn by the articles and photos printed in yesterday's paper. Some came out of curiosity, others out of guilt or pride. It was hard to tell which. Nathan watched from a distance as they walked the slope, touching the sign, whispering to each other as though afraid to disturb the air. He did not go to them. The story no longer belonged to him alone. It belonged to the land now, to the voices that had once hidden beneath it. Later that morning, Dr. Hines returned, carrying a folder under his arm. His eyes were bright despite the long drive. "It's spreading fast," he said, smiling. "2 regional papers want to run a feature. There's talk of a documentary. You've done something extraordinary, Nathan." "I just opened a door," Nathan replied quietly. The rest was already here. Hines nodded, understanding. "Still, opening a door takes courage. Most people spend their lives building new ones to keep the past locked away." They walked together toward the oak, where the earth had begun to dry. Hines crouched near the roots, touching the soil with the tenderness of someone handling something sacred. "We'll make sure this is protected," he said, "not just as a monument, but as a story told truthfully. Your grandfather deserves that. And so do you." Nathan thanked him, though the words felt too small. After the historian left, he stayed by the tree, lost in thought. He imagined his grandfather here, one night long ago, lantern in hand, leading frightened souls into the shelter beneath the roots. He could almost hear the soft creak of the wooden door, the murmur of voices, the hurried prayers whispered into darkness. The image filled him with quiet awe. How much faith it must have taken, not in religion, but in simple humanity, to do what Elijah Carter had done, to believe that saving others was worth the price of one's own safety. As afternoon faded, Miss Mabel arrived once more, walking slowly with her cane. Nathan met her halfway down the path, offering an arm she accepted with a soft laugh. "Don't fuss over me," she said. "I've walked this land longer than you've been alive." They sat together beneath the oak, the air thick with the hum of summer insects. Mabel looked at the door, now locked again, but newly painted to preserve it. "He'd be proud of you," she said. "Elijah. You gave his story back to him." "I wish my father could have seen it," Nathan said. "I think he wanted to believe it mattered, but he was too afraid of what people would say." Mabel's eyes softened. "He wasn't afraid for himself. He was afraid for you. You carry the blood of a man who defied the world, Nathan. That kind of truth makes enemies as easily as it makes admirers. But you've done right by it.